Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, have there ever been cases where Buddhist monks have acted violently in the face of severe injustice? There are many cases where words of wisdom cannot reach oppressors.
There have been a few. In some cases, it has been in response to inflammation from other parties, such as governments. Additionally, it has been in response to these grave injustices that you mention. There are some cases throughout history where they were used as the arms of a violent regime, but that's very rare.
Interesting. In those cases, what has happened to the monks? Have they been imprisoned or punished in any way?
Yes. When they have engaged in protest or revolution, they've usually been imprisoned and disrobed for their actions. When they've had connections or alliances to the military, however, if they survive engagements, then they usually have lived with impunity.
When they have engaged in protest or revolution, have they broken their vows of nonviolence?
Some do break their vows in the interest of the greater good. However, others remain nonviolent throughout.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Saffron Revolution of 2007. What was the Saffron Revolution of 2007? What were the circumstances that caused it? What is its legacy? We hope you find this enlightening. So let's get started. What was the Saffron Revolution of 2007?
The Saffron Revolution was a series of protests and demonstrations that took place in Myanmar in the fall of 2007. We've discussed the revolution briefly in our series on Buddhism and violence and social revolution, which will be linked in the show notes. The initial cause of the protests was a decision by the Myanmar military government to discontinue their subsidies on fuel prices. This caused fuel prices to skyrocket, which was itself enough to make people protest, but it was also the spark that lit up a lot of underlying disapproval of the military government, which we will discuss in the second question. The protests against the military government were led by activists, students, and many Buddhist monks as well, and the name of the revolution is a reference to the saffron-colored robes that the Buddhist monks wear. Buddhist monks were very prominent in the protests and received a lot of international attention and news coverage for their actions organizing, demonstrating, and sometimes even being arrested and detained in the course of their protests. Let's discuss the causes of the revolution and then work our way back around to the timeline of the protests.
What were the circumstances that caused the Saffron Revolution?
Since 1962, a military government, also called a junta, has been in power in Myanmar. As with all military juntas in history, this shaped Myanmar into an authoritarian state wherein all money flowed into the pockets of the strongmen warlords who were in charge. The military government was the single arbiter of the economy, and so naturally the people of Myanmar were among the poorest in the world, and what money and goods they did have were under the purview of the military government. The government was the sole seller of tons of household goods, including fuel and oil, but also rice, eggs, and other foodstuffs as well. These were nationalized industries, so the military government set prices with impunity. This led to them squeezing the people for all that they had under the threat of military power. While the UN was rating Myanmar among the poorest and most malnourished nations in the world, leaders in the military government were having giant, extravagant weddings, wearing and gifting each other diamonds worth millions of dollars, and other such opulent things. This only got worse in 2007. As early as February 2007, demonstrations and protests began against high prices in the city of Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon. These demonstrations of a few hundred protesters citywide resulted in 9 arrests. There were more protests in April, speaking to the high prices, but now also responding to the overreactive crackdown of the February protests. In mid-April, 2 organizers and members of a domestic human rights group were allegedly attacked by government goons, leading to their hospitalization. This sparked further demonstrations and protests. These April protests resulted in 8 more arrests, some of which were repeat arrests from the February ones. People were released, but only after agreeing that they would not protest ever again or organize any protests without getting military permission beforehand. Then, the military government went out and announced their intentions to crack down on these protests and demonstrations. This was a clear and blatant attempt to intimidate prospective protesters from ever organizing, and it got lots of attention internationally. Amnesty International and many other human rights groups began calling for investigations into the actions of the military government in response to these demonstrations. As you can see, things were already tense before the revolution kicked off in earnest. The government monopolies on commodities were out of control, and the economic inequality between the majority of Myanmar's people and the military had reached a ridiculous and unsustainable point. Now, let's get to the timeline of the revolution itself.
What was the timeline of the Saffron Revolution?
On August 15, 2007, the government removed subsidies on fuel, and this caused all prices to shoot up to even higher and more unaffordable levels than they had been before. The protests began on August 19th. The message of these protests had grown from just being about high prices to being a larger-scale message to end the military government and institute a democratic, civilian-led government with a free market. Within a short period after the protests had begun, the government arrested 13 prominent dissidents, activists, and organizers: Men Ko Naing, Ko Ko Gi, Men Zeya, Ko Jimmy, Pyon Cho, Arnt Bue Kiao, and Ko Mya Ai. They were charged with inciting civil unrest, disturbing and sabotaging the peace, disrupting the government, and much more. The U.S. Bush administration immediately denounced these arrests and called for these protesters and activists' immediate release. However, the military government didn't listen, and for the rest of August 2007, they continued unlawful crackdowns on protests. There were unlawful searches of people's houses, more arrests, and protesters continued to get charged with sabotaging the stability and the security of the state, and getting threatened with imprisonment. In September, things escalated even further. On September 5th, there was a peaceful demonstration taking place in Pakokku. This demonstration included some Buddhist monks. The troops of the military government forcibly broke up the demonstration, injuring 3 monks and allegedly killing 1. The killing of the 1 monk was never confirmed, but was reported by the monks as a reason for them escalating the conflict. In response to this alleged killing, some younger monks at Pakokku actually took some of the military troops hostage, and they demanded an apology from the government in response. The government didn't apologize, and so the Buddhist institutions in Myanmar divested themselves from the government entirely. This marked the beginning of the revolution in earnest. After that episode, protests erupted all over Myanmar, including larger and larger numbers of Buddhist monks. On September 22nd, approximately 2,000 monks marched through the city of Yangon and 10,000 through the city of Mandalay, with other demonstrations all across Myanmar. The whole time they marched, they chanted the Mae Tao Clinic, the Buddha's words on loving kindness. They marched through a barricade on the street in front of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who led demonstrations against the junta in the 80s and who was under house arrest at the time for those demonstrations. Even though she was under house arrest, she made a brief public appearance at the gate of her residence to accept the blessings of the marching Buddhist monks. On September 23rd, 150 nuns joined the protests in Yangon as well. 15,000 Buddhist monks and laypeople marched through Yangon on the 6th day of escalating peaceful protests, and they collectively vowed to continue the protests until the junta was deposed. On September 24th, it was reported that as many as 100,000 people were demonstrating in Yangon. Buddhist monks and nuns were also participating, but the military government especially warned them against demonstrating and against visiting Aung San Suu Kyi. On the same day, sanctions from the U.S. against Myanmar were announced at the UN General Assembly, with other countries also following suit. By this point, the protests had clearly gotten out of the military government's control. The next day, September 25th, the junta threatened demonstrators with military force and positioned army personnel and trucks at the Shwedagon Pagoda, the assembly point for monks leading and organizing the protests. To me, this suggests a rather personal vendetta against the monks for their having taken the junta soldiers hostage earlier in the month. Witnesses said that 5,000 people marched into the Shwedagon to form a human shield around the monks sheltering within. Army vehicles mounted with loudspeakers rode around the city of Yangon and clustered around the pagoda, blaring the following message. Quote, "People are not to follow, encourage, or take part in these marches. Action will be taken against those who violate this order." Unquote. This form of intimidation worked fairly well, as in October, the sizes of the demonstrations would dwindle considerably. Throughout the rest of September, crackdowns worsened. pro-democracy figures such as Wen Nang and the comedian Zargana were arrested in their homes in the middle of the night. Shwedagon Pagoda was attacked with tear gas, and protesters were beaten with batons. That day, there were reports of at least 3 Buddhist monks and 1 woman confirmed killed in the crackdown in Yangon. 300 people, including monks and nuns, were arrested in the protests. Reports then came out that the military junta had begun to wear red robes and shave their heads to infiltrate the monastic community. It's very difficult then to accurately recount the activities of the Buddhist monks for certain periods of time in the Saffron Revolution because it's hard to be sure if it was the monks themselves or if it was the infiltrators. Reports would circulate from a variety of sources that Buddhist monks were fighting and injuring junta members and making use of destructive protest tactics that resulted in harm to the general populace. These reports, true or not, would be used as justification for raiding monasteries and incarcerating monks. For example, rumors circulated that monks were attempting to kidnap soldiers and beat them up, or that they were sabotaging military infrastructure and damaging public property, injuring protesters and soldiers alike. This would all be denied by Buddhist leaders, and it likely never happened. The next day, the junta raided monasteries all over the country, arresting monks and seizing their belongings. In addition, more and more violence took place in the streets of Mandalay and Yangon. As many as 9 people were shot and killed by the junta, and 11 were injured. Some reports also said that DEET, a carcinogenic and very environmentally destructive insect spray, was also being used against protesters in the same manner as one would use tear gas. The next day, UN envoys, including Ibrahim Gambari, the special advisor on Myanmar to the United Nations, arrived in Yangon to press the junta to stop cracking down, release prisoners, and release Aung San Suu Kyi. Gambari was taken into the interior where he met with Suu Kyi, the acting prime minister, Thein Sein, and others, but not the leaders of the military junta, who denied him any meetings or audiences. In early October, the barricades around many large monasteries were removed, but the military presence remained. The military also roamed the streets of the cities day in and day out, preventing any large demonstrations from occurring again. Reports came out stating 5 more monks were killed in clashes with military forces, and many hundreds, if not thousands more, had been rounded up, forcibly detained, and their monasteries looted. Much of the violence in the large-scale demonstrations quieted down in October. Even so, October was marked by high-profile arrests of people who were involved both in the 2007 protests and in the earlier 1988 pro-democracy protests that resulted in Aung San Suu Kyi's arrest. Despite leaders from Myanmar promising to comply with pressures from the UN to let people go, reduce military presence in the cities, and stop rounding people up and incarcerating them. The protests eventually fizzled out, with many demands unmet, and for many, the revolution continues. Nevertheless, some progress has been made.
What is the legacy of the Saffron Revolution?
In 2008, a new constitution was approved as part of a quote-unquote roadmap to democracy. By the terms of this constitution, a general election was held in 2010, resulting in the dissolution of the junta in 2011. This election ended the military rule, but it installed civilians who were still highly sympathetic to the junta and were deep in their pockets, and the UN denounced the elections as having been fraudulent. Nevertheless, Aung San Suu Kyi still acted as a pro-democracy leader, and steps were taken to attempt to mend the wounds of the many years of junta rule and the resultant revolution. Many of the Buddhist leaders, such as U Gambira, who we discussed in our other episodes, were kept in prison until as late as 2012, and while imprisoned, they were tortured, stripped of their robes, and forced to give up their monastic names. Gambira was sentenced to 68 years in prison, 12 of which would be hard labor. In 2008, Gambira was transferred to a labor camp to serve out that hard labor, and then in 2009, he went on a hunger strike. All the while, his lawyer, his family, and those all around him advocated to the rest of the world to put pressure on the junta to release him immediately. This all failed until 2012, when he and many other protesters and activists were released in a mass pardon. He's continued to be harassed, rearrested, and generally bullied by junta officials ever since, and now finds himself in ailing health due to his treatment. He has memory loss, headaches, seizures, and more due to beatings, starvation, and torture endured during his imprisonment. In 2021, the armed forces of Myanmar instituted a coup against the civilian government in an attempt to retake control of the government for the junta. This coup was carried out in response to the general election of 2020, in which the pro-democracy party run by Aung San Suu Kyi won 396 out of 476 seats in parliament, beating the military's proxy party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, in a massive landslide. The armed forces detained many democratically elected leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi, who cannot catch a single break, and they also placed many parliament members under house arrest. They also detained many monks, who they still had grudges against for their actions in the 2007 revolution. Since then, junta rule has resumed, despite most of the world denouncing it and demanding that it end immediately, and that all political detainees be released.
I note with some bitterness that protests tend to be peaceful until law enforcement gets involved. Even today, with what we're seeing in the United States, law enforcement is usually the one that brings the violence.
That's true the world over, and it's true throughout all of history. Most of these protests are demonstrations that are simply meant to raise awareness, to disrupt the everyday, and to show that there is a big issue that people need to change their minds about. And then, in order to maintain the status quo and to protect those in power, law enforcement shows up, and knowing that just their presence is not enough to stop what they want stopped, they have to intervene somehow, usually violently. And this has been the case for as long as there have been law enforcement officers who serve a wealthy, elite government. To close out the episode, I would like to chant the light mantra for the safety and the preservation of the general health and prosperity of the majority of people in Myanmar who want a democratic government and want to live a life free from harassment and authoritarian control from the military junta. O nabo kyabe roshano makabora ramani handoma jinbara harabari tayaun. O nabo kyabe roshano makabora ramani handoma jinbara harabari tayaun. O nabo kyabe roshano makabora ramani handoma jinbara harabari tayaun. Thank you.
We hope you learned from this week's discussion on the Saffron Revolution. Join us next week where we will be discussing the second moral precept in Buddhism. What is the second moral precept in Buddhism? What is its significance? How have interpretations of it changed over time? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and want to support us financially, we ask that you send that generosity to people in need. For now, we recommend you support World Central Kitchen, an organization that works to feed communities in times of crisis. Right now, they are active in many areas, supporting people in the path of wildfires in America, in the wake of the earthquake in Afghanistan, Ukrainians fighting off foreign occupiers, and relieving the weaponized famine happening in Gaza. If you have the means, please join us in supporting their good work.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.